It remains the base case that Vice President Harris is unlikely to win, according to my sources in both parties. Not a sure thing, but unlikely to win Georgia, North Carolina, Arizona. If she doesn't win those 3 states, she must sweep Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. My reporting is that she's in trouble in Wisconsin. This is based on 3 sources, 2 Republicans, 1 Democrat, all of whom know the state quite well, and all of whom told me today the same version of they would be somewhere between surprised and shocked if Kamala Harris won Wisconsin.
All right, guys, we've got a pretty big election update for you here today. So please do us a big favor. If you're enjoying the content, be sure to hit that like button down below. And if you are new to the channel, make sure you subscribe. Why? Because your subscription ensures that we can continue to bring you these videos. The election is now just a handful of days away. Never been a better time. And by the way, PSA to all of our viewers, we will be live on election night, and it's going to be a pretty big stream, okay? We are converting the entire living room into a full-on newsroom. You guys will see it soon. Make sure you join us that night. Coverage should begin about 6, maybe 7 p.m. Eastern time. Haven't locked in the date yet there, but make sure you're tuned in. More details there to come soon. But with that said, let's talk about the election, right? Because we've done a lot of discussion about polls throughout the past year because polls are interesting, but at this point I will say they don't matter a tad, okay? The only thing that matters is the ballots going into those boxes. And with that said, we're going to look at some of the early voting today and show you what it is revealing. And I'll kind of spit the conclusion out, I guess, a little bit early here, which is the overall picture, I would say, for Donald Trump is it is looking good, but we're not finished, right? We need to still come through in the last stretch. And maybe that's kind of the ideal position you want to be in, because on one hand, you have reason for optimism. There's hope. You never want to get demoralized, but at the same time, there's no room to get complacent either. So the overall trend we have seen so far, and this is people who have voted so far and based on their party affiliation, is that in states with widespread and accessible early in-person voting, right? Republicans prefer to vote in person. In everywhere that's a swing state, we are either tied or outright leading. I'll show you this here in a second. So for instance, in North Carolina, we currently, as of November 1st, this morning, have a narrow lead in North Carolina. Again, early voting so far. You can see here, it's not a big lead, right? 0.2%. It's about an 8,000 vote difference right now. But the fact that you are going into election day with the lead and assuming that Republicans win the election day vote pretty convincingly, which they historically do, we know there's still plenty of Republicans who probably prefer to vote on election day, although we have to also make sure they go and do it, right? And that's why I say there's no room for complacency either. You look at a number like North Carolina, again, if you're going into election day with the lead, you are pretty comfortable in the Republicans assuming you should be able to get this done. In Arizona, the picture is even better because we have an outright, frankly, folks, pretty dominating lead in the state of Arizona. So currently, Arizona Republicans lead the Democrats there by a margin of 163,000 votes. For contrast, back in 2020, around this time in history, Democrats went into election day with a lead themselves of around 100,000 votes. I think in 2022, it was like around 20 to 30,000 votes. So again, not very precedented with our current election system to go into election day already with the lead. But you can see in Arizona, you're looking right now, assuming the election day vote again comes through, even to a smaller degree, even if it's not what it was, say, back in 2020, assuming the Republicans win the election day vote, frankly, at all in Arizona, you can pretty comfortably say Donald Trump will carry that state of Arizona. And you can see here, for instance, by comparison, on October 28th in 2020, Democrats had a 122,000 vote lead. In 2022, it was 23,000. So again, this is not something we are necessarily that used to looking at. In Georgia, currently the Democrats lead the early vote with 48% of that vote in total by 2%. So that's not a lot, right? Not a huge gap to be necessarily having to overcome on election day. So on paper in Georgia, it's not necessarily looking as good as, say, North Carolina or Arizona because we're not outright winning, right? But still not a super bad margin to have to make up, way less than what we had in the past several elections. And this perhaps also is a good indication indicator for Republicans. If you look at the turnout by ethnicity, guys, white voters are overperforming the early vote so far by 7 points, but this is also a big one in the state of Georgia, especially for Democrats. Black turnout is down 6%. Why does that matter so much? Well, let's just be straightforward about it, okay? And nobody take this the wrong way, but it's just simply the truth. The black vote is very important for Democrats in the state of Georgia. We've heard a lot of rumblings. We've seen it in the polls. We've seen it in the focus groups. I did a street video recently in Georgia that you should go watch with James Klug, where we saw this as well. The black enthusiasm overall for Kamala Harris is way down from what it was under Barack Obama and even what it was for Joe Biden. If that black vote does not come through and white voters make a disproportionate share of the electorate compared to what there used to be, general wisdom says, right, that you should be able to win the state of Georgia based on those numbers. It's going to rely on some Republicans in the last day of early voting, which is Saturday, and obviously on election day, coming through and closing that very narrow lead that Democrats currently have. But again, not really a bad situation. So in the Sun Belt, things overall are looking pretty decent at the moment. And why is that? Because again, early in-person voting is very common in these Sun Belt states. And that explains why people might look at these numbers in the Rust Belt and say, well, if we're doing so well in the Sun Belt, why in the Rust Belt are we seemingly so far behind? Although I will put those numbers again into perspective in terms of what we were looking at in the past elections. But it is true, right? In Michigan, in Pennsylvania, in Wisconsin, you don't have that same type of early in-person voting. You can do absentee voting. They have the system where I think you can like take it to a courthouse or something early in Pennsylvania, but it's not as widespread. It's more of an election day state if you want to vote in person, generally speaking. And so that makes a big difference, right? Because Republicans are now embracing voting early, but they still want to do it in person. But with that said, Republicans are actually continuing to narrow the gap between Democrats and Republicans, even when it comes to the returning of mail-in and absentee ballots. About a week ago, Democrats led that metric by 6%. Now it is just 3.1%. And in total numbers, the Democrats currently only have a lead over the Republicans with all the ballots cast so far of about 400,000 votes. So that's how much we are currently trailing based on party registration in the state of Pennsylvania. Now, on paper, that might sound really bad until you understand that back in 2020, guess how much Democrats led by? Guess how much their supposed firewall going into election day was? It was 1 million. Right. So you actually are seeing a huge drop off in just raw numbers of ballots then compared to now. And by the way, before people freak out too much about these Rust Belt states, last thing to point out here is because of the lack of widespread in-person early voting, you're looking at an electorate where, for instance, in PA, only 19% of the total expected ballots have been cast so far. Not nearly as much as, say, a state like Georgia, where we've already got about 48% of the electorate having voted so far. So with that said, it's like, what are we really looking at right now? Well, Republicans are in a very good position when you compare it back to where they were in 2020. It should be enough. Again, this is the big thing, though. Assuming that on election day, Republicans, even if it's not as much as 2020, right? Because I'm sure some people who voted on election day back then have now voted early. But just assuming we win the election day vote by a comfortable margin, it doesn't have to be 2020, but it just has to be pretty good, right? We should be able to basically sweep most of the battleground states. But the one point of Republican panic I keep hearing is the gender divide. And you can see that in these numbers, right? In terms of early voting, for instance, in Pennsylvania, 56% of the votes cast so far have been by women. Only 44% have been men. In comparison, for instance, to 2020, by the way, I should point out this data is about a week old, so it has changed, right? Men have closed the gap, but I'm pointing this out because Kamala Harris's campaign is running around with this graphic right now. For instance, in Arizona, it's women 52, men 46. In PA, 56 to 44. In Georgia, 56 to 44, right? So women have dominated dominated men so far when it comes to the early voting. And this is true, even if I would point out this graphic is a week old and those numbers have narrowed. So the current state of panic is, well, where are the men? Are the men staying home? What are we doing here? Come on, boys, we got to get this done. The one thing I would point out, though, before there's too much hysteria about this idea that, like, you know, men are staying home, they're being lazy because they don't want to save the country. Look at the early voting numbers. Guys, I think it's reasonable to suspect that a lot of men will vote last minute, whether that's the last few days of early voting. For instance, I voted just today on November 1st, and I've been preaching early voting. And what did I do? I waited till the second to last day to early vote. We'll talk about that in a second. But first of all, for instance, the guy from Rasmussen pointed this out. He says, male turnout is lower than women, and you can see those crosstabs yourself. As of the time of the PA poll, with 27% of the vote in, women have outvoted men by 3%. However, men, according to polls, according to data, plan to outvote women by 8% on election day. What has to happen for Trump to win is that all of the men in the electorate who have been relatively quiet so far, have not shown up to early voting like maybe we wish they would, have to show up very late and also on election day to do so. Now, with that said, I don't want to downplay anything. We cannot get complacent. We have to make sure your guy friends, make sure you're kind of encouraging them, reminding them, hey, you got to go vote. But with that said, I really do think it's going to happen. And I'll tell you why, okay? Before people panic too much about this lack of male turnout so far, if we know anything about men, what is true? It's that we are natural procrastinators. Is that not true? It's completely true, right? We will wait till the last minute to do anything. We will always go to the deadline. There's a reason why when you go to a shopping mall on Christmas Eve, who is overwhelmingly in the building? It is men. We always do things at the last minute. That's what Rasmussen's data has shown, but it's also what my intuition has shown. And I'll say this, speaking from personal experience. Okay, let's talk about myself. And maybe I'm a hypocrite because I've been encouraging early voting a lot and saying, hey, look, you got to get your vote in there. But I voted today. November 1st is the second to last day of early voting in Florida. And I, as a guy with my guy instincts, just waited around for the past 2 weeks and said, okay, I'll do it. And eventually I got in there. Okay, I wasn't not going to do it, but it's an issue of I'll do it later. I'll do it later. And again, I don't want to encourage that type of behavior. Because, you know, things can happen. People can just end up never doing it. The guy can get so lazy that he doesn't do anything. So I'm not saying it's good. But at the same time, before you freak out about it too much, trust in the boys. Okay, we are gonna do it. That's my intuition. You know, you've seen every day that goes on with early voting, the gender gap continues to narrow. More and more men are going to vote. When I went to vote on Friday, November 1st, I noticed in line, because I was hearing this statistic, I had this theory before, it was probably about 60 to 65% men in the building at the time. Now that's anecdotal. Maybe it's just my batch of the line, right? But it is to suggest, guys, I think we'll be fine. Okay, I think the men are going to go out and do it. We have to encourage them, but at the same time, I wouldn't panic too much because, again, we're just natural procrastinators. You know, that's what we do, okay? So if you need the kind of silent men so far in the electorate to go out and vote on election day, and the data says they should be, and they probably will, I think they will, okay? And if they do that, if all the boys show up on election day and everyone else who has not voted, I think we're going to be fine. We just got to make sure, again, we close any gaps we have, come through on election day, and we should be able to do this, okay? So with that said, ladies and gentlemen, let me know your thoughts on all of this and the current state of the election down below. Be sure to leave a like on this video, subscribe if you are new, and until next time, God bless and peace.